Stasi Superpower. East Germany's secret police and the web of control. Chapter 1 Birth of the Stasi. The year was 1945. Germany lay in ruins, divided into 4 occupied zones by the victorious Allies. Cities were shattered, millions were displaced, and the world was shifting into a new conflict, the Cold War. From the ashes of the Third Reich, a new confrontation emerged. East versus West, communism versus capitalism. And in the Soviet-controlled zone of Germany, a new state was taking shape, the German Democratic Republic, or GDR. From its very beginning in 1949, the East German state was built on insecurity. The leadership in East Berlin feared not only the capitalist West across the border, but also its own people. East Germany was supposed to be a workers' paradise, but in reality, many citizens resisted the Communist Party's grip. Dissent simmered beneath the surface, and thousands fled across the border to West Germany in search of freedom. The Soviet Union, which controlled East Germany in those early years, understood that military power alone would not be enough to hold the state together. What was needed was a tool of total control, a secret police force that could protect the communist regime from its enemies, both foreign and domestic. In 1950, that tool was created. It was called the Staatssicherheitsdienst, or State Security Service. The world would come to know it by a simpler name, the Stasi. Officially, the Stasi was described as the shield and sword of the party. Its mission was clear, to defend the Socialist Unity Party, the ruling power in East Germany, at all costs. But defense did not mean protecting the people. It meant protecting the regime, against critics, against opposition, and even against the ordinary citizens it claimed to serve. At first, the Stasi was a relatively small organization, modeled on the Soviet NKVD and later the KGB. Its early leaders were trained in Moscow, steeped in the methods of Stalinist repression. They understood that fear was a more powerful weapon than bullets. And from the beginning, the Stasi operated in the shadows, detaining, interrogating, and intimidating those suspected of disloyalty. The 1950s in East Germany were a time of unrest. Workers protested against food shortages and poor living conditions. Dissidents published underground pamphlets and organized small resistance groups. Thousands more fled across the open border to the west, draining the east of skilled workers and threatening the regime's stability. The Stasi moved quickly, infiltrating protest groups, arresting suspected organizers, and planting informants in every sector of society. One turning point came in 1953, when a massive workers' uprising shook East Germany. Protests spread through cities, calling for free elections and better living conditions. Soviet tanks rolled into the streets to crush the rebellion, killing dozens. But behind the scenes, it was the Stasi that built the surveillance machine to ensure such an uprising could never happen again. Every worker, every student, every soldier became a potential suspect. By the late 1950s, the Stasi was already developing into a monstrous institution. Unlike the Gestapo of Nazi Germany, which relied on visible terror, the Stasi thrived on invisibility. It did not need to arrest everyone, it only needed people to believe they might be watched. The uncertainty created a society where trust dissolved, where every conversation could be reported, where silence became safer than truth. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 was the ultimate symbol of East Germany's paranoia. The wall was built to keep citizens from fleeing to the west, but it also marked the Stasi's growing power. Behind that wall, the Stasi would perfect its methods of control, building what would become the most invasive surveillance system in modern history. What began in 1950 as a small Soviet-style police agency was transforming into something far more terrifying, a machine designed not only to monitor the people of East Germany but to control them completely. And as the years went on, the Stasi would grow into a state within a state, more powerful, more feared, and more intrusive than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 2: The Machinery of Surveillance. By the 1960s, the Stasi had grown from a modest secret police force into the beating heart of East Germany's security state. Its headquarters in Berlin-Lichtenberg, an enormous grey complex known as Normannenstrasse, expanded into a sprawling maze of offices, archives, and interrogation rooms. From there, the Ministry for State Security managed an apparatus of surveillance so vast that it would eventually employ over 90,000 full-time officers and command a network of nearly 200,000 informants, known as IMs, or inoffizielle Mitarbeiter. In a country of 16 million people, it meant that 1 in 50 citizens was directly connected to the Stasi's web. The machinery of surveillance was not crude. It was sophisticated, meticulous, and terrifyingly thorough. Every East German could be monitored, whether they were a factory worker, a university professor, a priest, or even a child. The Stasi's philosophy was simple. There was no such thing as an innocent citizen, only potential threats who had not yet revealed themselves. Technology played a central role. The Stasi operated wiretaps on tens of thousands of phones, intercepting calls from East Germans to the West, but also monitoring conversations within the GDR itself. Rooms were bugged with microphones hidden in furniture, hotel rooms were fitted with cameras behind mirrors, and entire buildings were wired for sound. Mail was routinely opened, photographed, and resealed before being delivered, sometimes without the recipient ever knowing. The Stasi even had teams of experts who collected and catalogued the smells of citizens, storing jars with cotton pads that had absorbed body odors, so that dogs could track dissidents later. But the most effective weapon of the Stasi was not technology. It was people. The vast network of informants penetrated every level of society. Some were coerced with threats or blackmail. Others volunteered, motivated by ideology, ambition, or even personal grudges. Teachers spied on students, priests spied on congregants, children spied on parents. The result was a society where no one could ever feel safe. To break opposition, the Stasi developed methods far subtler than brute force. While arrests and prison sentences were common, the organization increasingly relied on psychological warfare. This strategy was known as Zersetzung, literally, decomposition. Instead of openly punishing dissenters, the Stasi sought to destroy their lives quietly. Targets of Zersetzung would find their careers mysteriously blocked, friendships poisoned by rumors, marriages strained by anonymous letters hinting at infidelity. Phones would ring in the middle of the night with no one on the line. Appliances broke, mail vanished, children were harassed at school. The goal was not to kill or imprison the dissident. It was to isolate, exhaust, and humiliate them until they gave up resistance altogether. The scale of documentation was staggering. The Stasi kept detailed files on millions of citizens, storing them in endless archives of paper. Each file could contain transcripts of calls, photographs, financial records, psychological assessments, even intimate details of private lives. By the 1980s, the Stasi's archives filled 111 kilometers of shelf space, an ocean of secrets that mapped the private lives of an entire nation. For many East Germans, the Stasi became a shadow that followed them everywhere. Conversations at work, at school, even at family dinners could be reported. A casual joke about the regime could end up in an official file. Trust evaporated. Suspicion took root. A neighbor's friendly smile could hide betrayal. The machinery of surveillance was not designed only to catch spies or saboteurs. Its real purpose was more insidious: to create a climate of constant fear, where citizens policed themselves. People learned to censor their own thoughts, to avoid speaking too freely, to distrust even their closest companions. In this way, the Stasi achieved what armies and walls never can. It colonized the minds of an entire nation. And yet, the Stasi's influence did not stop at East Germany's borders. While it perfected its control at home, it was also turning its gaze outward, building one of the most effective espionage networks in the Cold War. Chapter 3: Everyday Life Under Watch. To understand the power of the Stasi, you must imagine the texture of everyday life in East Germany. Life in the GDR was not a world of barbed wire and tanks on every corner. It was something more insidious. The true prison was invisible, woven into conversations, workplaces, schools, and even families. The Stasi's strength lay in its ability to make ordinary people doubt themselves, mistrust their neighbors, and fear their own words. For an East German, surveillance was not always obvious, but it was always felt. A casual phone call to a friend in West Berlin could end with a sudden click on the line, a reminder that someone might be listening. Letters took longer than expected to arrive, sometimes torn or clumsily resealed. A colleague might ask strangely probing questions, or a neighbor might appear at your door with too much interest in your activities. These were the subtle fingerprints of the Stasi's presence. Children grew up with warnings whispered by parents. Don't repeat what we say at home. The danger was real. A careless remark made at school could be reported by a teacher, or even by another child whose parents were informants. Families learned to live double lives. One face for the outside world, another for the privacy of their home, though even that privacy could never be guaranteed. At work, the surveillance was suffocating. Factories, universities, and offices were riddled with informants. An engineer who applied for permission to travel abroad might find his request denied without explanation, because a secret report labeled him unreliable. A professor whose lectures strayed too far from the official ideology might be summoned for questioning. A doctor who expressed doubt about the regime's efficiency could suddenly lose patients or be reassigned to a remote clinic. Careers, reputations, and futures could vanish with a few strokes of the Stasi's pen. Religion was no refuge either. Churches were infiltrated, their priests and pastors watched closely. Some clergymen cooperated willingly, others resisted quietly, but always under suspicion. Even in sacred spaces, the faithful could never be sure who sat in the pews beside them, or who would carry their words to the Stasi. The regime's psychological weapon, Zersetzung, made life unpredictable. Dissidents found their marriages sabotaged by anonymous letters hinting at affairs. Students who spoke against the state suddenly failed exams, regardless of their grades. Activists woke to find their cars mysteriously vandalized, their homes searched, their friends drifting away under pressure. The brilliance of Zersetzung was that it left no clear evidence of persecution. Victims often felt as if they were losing their minds, precisely the effect the Stasi intended. Fear shaped even the smallest choices. People avoided speaking freely in cafes or on trains. They lowered their voices when discussing politics at home. Many avoided keeping diaries, fearing that their own written words could one day be used against them. In East Germany, silence was survival. But the most corrosive effect was on trust. The Stasi's reliance on informants created a society where betrayal was always possible. A friend could be pressured into reporting. A spouse might be blackmailed into cooperation. Even children, manipulated with rewards or fear, sometimes became unwitting sources of information. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, many East Germans would discover with shock that the person who had informed on them for years was someone they loved or respected. For the average East German, life under watch was a balancing act. Comply enough to stay safe, but resist enough to hold on to dignity. Some adapted, some conformed, some broke. Others tried to flee, risking their lives at the Berlin Wall or through underground escape networks. But for those who stayed, the Stasi was always there, unseen but ever present, turning everyday life into a quiet battlefield of fear and obedience. And while this suffocating grip crushed dissent at home, the Stasi was also building a reputation abroad. The same system that spied on citizens in East Berlin was now reaching into NATO headquarters, Western governments, and foreign corporations. The secret police of East Germany were about to step onto the global stage. Chapter 4 International reach. The Stasi's grip over East Germany was absolute, but its ambitions reached far beyond the Berlin Wall. While the organization perfected the art of domestic surveillance, it also became one of the most effective intelligence services in the world. Its spies slipped quietly into NATO headquarters, foreign ministries, corporations, and even activist movements abroad. For a country of only 16 million people, East Germany wielded an intelligence apparatus that rivaled, and in some ways surpassed, those of the superpowers. At the height of the Cold War, the Stasi worked hand in glove with the KGB, learning from Moscow while also providing valuable intelligence of its own. East German officers trained in Soviet schools, exchanged tradecraft with their Russian counterparts, and coordinated operations across Europe. But the Stasi was not simply Moscow's junior partner. It developed its own networks and, in certain fields, earned a reputation for professionalism and ruthlessness that even impressed the Soviets. One of the Stasi's most infamous divisions was the Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung, HVA, or Main Directorate for Reconnaissance. Led for decades by spymaster Markus Wolf, the HVA became legendary in espionage circles. Known as the man without a face, because Western intelligence agencies lacked a photograph of him for years, Wolf orchestrated some of the most audacious penetrations of Western institutions. Under Wolf's direction, Stasi agents infiltrated the West German government at astonishing levels. Politicians, civil servants, and even close aides to the Chancellor were revealed to have been passing information to East Berlin. Through these channels, the Stasi gained access to NATO's strategies, diplomatic cables, and military plans. But infiltration was not limited to governments. The Stasi also spied on corporations, feeding industrial secrets back to East German industries. In some cases, this intelligence was passed directly to Moscow, giving the Soviets an edge in technology and economics. Critics later accused the Stasi of enabling industrial espionage on an industrial scale. The methods were varied. Some agents were recruited through ideology, convinced that socialism was the future. Others were seduced, blackmailed, or manipulated into cooperation. The Stasi was a master of Romeo agents, male operatives who seduced secretaries and clerks working in Western ministries, exploiting personal relationships to extract classified information. These operations blurred the line between spycraft and emotional exploitation, but they were devastatingly effective. In addition to traditional espionage, the Stasi also targeted dissidents abroad. Refugees who had fled East Germany often found themselves still under the watchful eye of their homeland's secret police. Infiltrators monitored exile communities, disrupted opposition groups in the West, and sometimes carried out intimidation campaigns to remind defectors that escape did not mean freedom from surveillance. The Stasi's international operations extended across the globe. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, East German advisors worked with Allied regimes, training their secret police in surveillance, interrogation, and repression. In countries like Angola, Ethiopia, and Cuba, the techniques honed in East Berlin were exported abroad, spreading the Stasi's dark expertise to other authoritarian states. By the 1980s, Western intelligence agencies regarded the Stasi as one of their most formidable adversaries. Despite its small size compared to the CIA or MI6, East Germany's secret police consistently punched above its weight. NATO officers warned that the flow of information to East Berlin was alarmingly consistent, and often devastating. And yet, the Stasi's reach carried the same corrosive effects abroad as at home. Its spies spread distrust, sowed division, and deepened the paranoia of the Cold War. In West Germany especially, the revelation of Stasi infiltrators shattered confidence in institutions and fueled fears that no alliance, no cabinet meeting, no private conversation was truly safe. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 would eventually reveal just how deep the Stasi's tentacles extended. Files recovered from East Berlin exposed decades of espionage, confirming that the GDR's secret police had managed to entangle itself in the very fabric of the West. But as the wall crumbled, the empire of surveillance that had once seemed indestructible began to collapse as well. Chapter 5: Collapse and Legacy. In the autumn of 1989, East Germany stood on the brink. The Soviet Union was weakening, protests erupted across Eastern Europe, and the Berlin Wall, long the ultimate symbol of communist control, was beginning to crumble. For nearly 4 decades, the Stasi had held East Germany in its iron grip, creating a society suffocated by fear, betrayal, and silence. But in a matter of weeks, its empire of surveillance would collapse like a house of cards. As demonstrations spread across East German cities in October and November 1989, the Stasi found itself powerless. For years, it had controlled dissent by targeting individuals, isolating them, and dismantling opposition movements before they could grow. But now, hundreds of thousands of citizens were in the streets, demanding freedom, chanting for democracy. No amount of surveillance or Zersetzung could stop a revolution that had outgrown fear. Inside the Stasi headquarters on Normannenstrasse, panic reigned. Officers shredded documents, burned files, and frantically tried to erase the record of their activities. They knew what those archives contained: decades of secret reports, millions of pages detailing the private lives of nearly every East German. If those files were made public, they would expose not just the machinery of the Stasi, but also the names of ordinary people, neighbors, co-workers, even family members, who had been informants. But the people did not wait. On January 15, 1990, crowds stormed the Stasi headquarters in East Berlin. Protesters poured through the halls, seizing documents, exposing rooms filled with surveillance equipment, and finally seeing with their own eyes the extent of the secret police's power. What they found was staggering. By the time the Stasi was officially dissolved, its archives contained over 111 kilometers of files, including 1.7 million photographs, 30,000 films, and 27,000 audio recordings. There were files on nearly every citizen in East Germany, detailing friendships, phone calls, political opinions, even personal secrets. For many, the greatest shock came not from the existence of the files themselves, but from the names inside. Wives discovered husbands had reported them. Children discovered their parents had informed. Friendships collapsed under the weight of betrayal. The exposure of the archives forced Germany to confront a painful truth. The Stasi had not simply been a state institution, it had turned ordinary citizens into instruments of repression. The wounds of that betrayal still linger today. In the decades since reunification, Germany has worked to preserve and study the Stasi archives. Victims can request access to their files, though the experience is often harrowing. Some find closure, others find heartbreak. The files are both a record of suffering and a warning for the future. Internationally, the Stasi's fall revealed the sheer scale of its espionage. Western governments were shocked at how deeply East German agents had penetrated NATO, industry, and politics. Markus Wolf, the spymaster of the HVA, was finally unmasked and put on trial, though he remained defiant to the end. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Stasi lies in the lessons it left behind. The collapse of East Germany showed that even the most invasive surveillance system cannot ultimately control a people's desire for freedom. And yet, the shadow of the Stasi lives on as a cautionary tale. In an age of digital surveillance, facial recognition, and mass data collection, many see echoes of East Germany's methods. The tools have changed, but the questions remain the same. How much privacy must be surrendered for security? Who decides what is dangerous? And how do free societies prevent themselves from sliding into quiet authoritarianism? The Stasi once called itself the shield and sword of the party, but history has judged it differently. It became a prison guard for an entire nation, one that ruled not through open violence, but through fear, betrayal, and silence. When the wall fell, that prison collapsed. But the scars it left, on individuals, on families, on memory, remain etched into the history of Germany and the world. This was the story of Stasi Superpower, East Germany's secret police and the web of control, a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest prisons are invisible. If you found this deep dive into Cold War history fascinating, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more untold stories from the hidden battlefields of espionage and power.